if you're truly innovating, you are in uncharted territory. There's not a blueprint, and typically journeys like that, you're at risk of confirmation bias that you're doing the right thing. Both you and I probably grew up going to pools that had a big high dive. And as you're climbing up there, kind of everybody can see you making the climb. You're bad enough. You're bad enough. You're making this climb. And then you get up there, and the view is always a little different than what you thought. Like, it looked like a cool thing. It looked highly doable. And then you get up there, and the first thing is, are you going to walk that plank? And it feels to me like perfect imagery for the startup. You've told people that you're going to do this thing. Folks are watching you. You've kind of got the supporters and the naysayers. The people who are like, "But you have a good job, Gary. Like, why leave that? How many babies do you have?" It's kind of frightening as you're going up there, realizing that the view from the top is really different than when you started the journey. So, like, what gave you the audacity
Yeah.
to make that climb?
I probably, if I would have thought about it, I probably wouldn't have. But you, you do have to be wired a certain way. And, we always tease, and I've been teased about, gee, most people are ready, aim, fire, and I'm ready, fire, aim, and always have been. And on the one hand, that's cute and it's funny, but on the other hand, it's kind of important. There are types of people that shouldn't be entrepreneurs.
Mm.
They're not, their constitution isn't such that they can handle the inevitable ups and downs. And that's not an indictment of them. It's just a fact.
Right.
And I more I feel very lucky that I happen to have been ready, fire, aim, or I'd have thought about it, and maybe I'd have overthought about it. And that's what happens to people who like certainty, who like to be sure they think about things from every angle. And your whole point at the start is you almost guaranteed that jump down is going to be different than you thought it was going to be. And frankly, and I love when you said walking the plank. It's like, oh man, yeah, that imagery is closer to the imagery. Have you run into people who, when you're talking with them about their startups and they inevitably hit a pothole or a speed bump or something, and the thought going through your head was not about how to course correct, pivot, do whatever, but more of, oh, this poor soul, they shouldn't be an entrepreneur. I mean, have you ever experienced that
Yeah.
in the middle of a conversation with somebody?
It's not just a one conversation, it's more of an arc. I find people who think that CEO is the pinnacle of existence and therefore I must come up with something to be a CEO. And they'll become, the CEO of something that's really like a lifestyle business. It's like, we can all call anything CEO. I can be a CEO tomorrow of somebody who sits around and thinks about
Yeah.
stuff. You know what I mean? Like, so people become enamored with the label, and then they start some activities, none of which are an actual business. So there's that piece of people not fully understanding, or people thinking it's like a little bit of a racket. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just like, even though rackets usually are considered negative, they feel like if I just get kind of that lucky thing, it'll solve itself. And it is an easier path than the job that they have, not realizing, no, when you're everything and all parts of it, and you're the strategy and you're the crank, and you've got to make sure that everybody else understands their role, and you've got to finance the business and see and steer it through, that it's a much harder job. And some people don't realize that. They just think, oh, this will be a dream thing because it'll be this easy street notion,
Yeah.
when it's 10 times harder than a
Yeah.
job.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And that particular example they get exposed really early. If they come in with the mindset you described, because it is chaotic. Launching a business is chaotic enough if you know it's going to be that way. How do you how do you move when you're talking to an entrepreneur? They come to talk with you about what's going on with them. How do you nudge them out of their delusion, if you will, of what led them to start this and to get in the situation that puts them in front of you? How do you what words do you use to try and get that person back where they need to be?
Well, here's the thing, if I think it's actually a good enough idea and it's really a wiring question or there's some gap there that if filled, yes, this idea could move forward. This has a business viability to it. Then it's a question of bringing on team. I thought, when you talked about your roommate and how that was a complement to your ability to envision and to risk take, he had modeled it all up. He still hadn't pulled that trigger
Yep.
on the risk take because you're the guy who's, when you're getting to the end of the plank, you're
Yeah.
like, let's jump. And he might want to, what is it,
No.
measure twice, cut once, like one more time. And it's like, no. Some of the things that I see are people, again, trying to be this solo captain of their ship and not realizing that it's going to be some of the team that they put together that truly makes this a business in the way that I think most entrepreneurs go
Yeah.
into this when they want something that will scale and grow and become a thing.
Yeah. Good. Good. So let's move one step, keeping with this topic. So let's move one rung up the food chain. Now we've got someone sitting in front of us talking about their business, and they do have the temperament, but they've got their accent on the wrong syllable, if you will, of what's important, the what's important now thing. How do I sequence things? How do I think? How do I make everything come together? And so they're all over the place. They're all over the road, but you can see they truly need a mentor. They need someone to push them. And I have been that person enough over the years that I have developed it. I am highly sensitive to when I see someone, I call it looking out the window versus looking in the mirror. When everything that's
Hmm.
gone wrong for them, they'll tell you in detail, well, it was external this, it was external that, it was it was anything but us. They'll acknowledge, yeah, yeah, we're certifiably in the ditch, but it wasn't our doing. So what do we do now? And I have found the tool that for me has worked for me is telling, well, let's see your sizzle deck. Since the whole notion behind a sizzle deck is you're trying to hook someone, you're fishing, and you're trying to hook someone who wants
Yeah.
to take another card so you can show them a financial deck. And and I and when I see those decks that weren't really thought through, it's because everything's about them and with their experience, their belief about what the sector, whatever, but it's done very inwardly facing, as opposed to we see a problem in the marketplace that needs to be solved. The object of this is to have the person that goes through this deck go, whoa, very interesting. The sizzle works so that they go,
Hmm.
yeah, sure,
Yeah.
let's see some of your numbers. What do you project here? You never want to show those in a sizzle deck. You want to make sure you have sold the vision. And I think that
Well, and created a story and a thesis statement. The thing is, if you can't really explain why this is a thing coherently that other people can follow, you may have gaps in it. Sometimes like I get these ideas in my own head about anything, like not even business, but just about anything, and it's almost like when you have a dream and you wake up and you can't explain it because it suddenly doesn't make sense, but it made complete sense when you were having the dream. I find that that can happen to people trying to craft a business. That when you put it down on paper and try to explain it, you start to see where it's like, dang, that was a really good idea until I had to make it hang together. And that exercise, I think, lets people, learn that a little bit for themselves.
And it all will rise or fall based on them, as opposed to what you always talked about, which is team building. How do you better be good and damn sure that whatever it is you're doing is the most mission critical thing that the company can do, and that you are bringing people up to support whatever those activities are underneath you. And a lot of people, and we've seen that on our podcast multiple times, where at the end of the podcast, when we say to them, what have you learned here? We've had more than a few entrepreneurs say,
Yeah.
didn't really think about what you said about I should be trying to work myself out of a job at this level.
Or what their real business was. You mentioned, like, if you're shooting at a lot of different things, how do you bring that together? Creating that better sizzle deck might also tell you this is the lane that we need to win in. And if we can't win in this lane, all these other things that we could do are really outgrowths. It's like, what is that core thing you
Yeah.
have to get right? And it'll be their journey and it'll be their own lesson. Um, my mother and her sister decided, growing up in a family of a funeral home owner and director, they were the children and grandchildren of funeral directors, and they thought we should do burial garments. They did zero research. Um, they, self-funded. They went out and they got some people who could sew, and they self-designed. Okay, these are two people. One was a sociologist who then later got her PhD in sociology, and the other was a zoologist. So we're talking about people who weren't even in that space, who just thought, I think I could make a burial garment. They learned a lot about that business, and they came to the decision, you know what? This is not a viable business, nor should it be. But, that was fun. That was interesting. And so people deserve to go
Yeah.
on that journey. The other thing that I was thinking about is if you're truly innovating, you are in uncharted territory. There's not a blueprint, and typically journeys like that, you're at risk of confirmation bias that you're doing the right thing. And so finding somebody, advisory, either, kind of mentor, advisor, advisory board, partner, someone to help balance that, and help you refine what you think is right. You start the thing, and it's going to be bootstrapping. It's going to be what it is. But pretty quickly, as you are modeling this, you shouldn't model a thing unless you really are kind of all of this innovation. You shouldn't model the thing without thinking a little bit about that. And some of it's going to be shoestring. Some of it's going to be there are people who enjoy doing it and are willing to be what I'll call first mover advisors, who really will advise you up to a point for free and to kind of learn about this and see where it's going. But then, if you're looking for more, you need to start thinking about, is this somebody who's willing to make an equity play? Are you having these conversations with people who can then put money in, and so they're joining into it and they're going to bet on the success of this with you, and then that's their cash, until you get to a point where you can actually pay. There's so many
Yeah.
levels of size and company. In the private equity space, yes, there are paid members of boards, there are paid advisors. They're not really at market, but they're paid, and they get kind of friends and family equity access, and they're there to see, win, lose, or draw on that.
While I have you, it triggered a thought, because the other type of entrepreneur we haven't talked about is the one that's, sure enough, they're the walking wounded and don't know it. And as you've listened to them
Mm.
describe their business, the situation they're faced with, and in your mind is fairly clear, it's game, set, match. How How have you had success in breaking that kind of news? How do you think about it? How do you talk about it with entrepreneurs who have come to you not expecting to hear that?
Well, you gotta have the what next. In my experience, I've seen kind of, I guess, three things. One, somebody who's not ready to hear that at all, and you know it, and so you just let that be its own lesson. They got to come to you at the point where they know it's between them and something fairly dire. Sometimes people are really looking at some economic hardships. They're looking at debt. They're looking at things that will really touch them and their families. And so you've got to go in and say, let's wind this thing down and let's figure out how we preserve you. And then the what's next. Sometimes you can look at a business model and say, well, what you've done here is a recipe for failure here pretty quick. But if you make these certain tweaks, if you look at what's the value here, who's keeping the value, how do you preserve it? Once upon a time, I was advising somebody who thought they should be the soup to nuts of a particular idea. And I said, there are other folks who are going to be better size, scope, and scale at executing on this, but you've got an amazing idea. You want to do a license to it. You want to go in and say, "Here, I'm an advisor. I'm going to license you this idea. I'm here to continue putting in that intellectual capital," because truly coming up with a very innovative idea is the difficult part. But you've got these entities that are larger that need that innovation, that can't move like that. It's like the clipper ship versus the giant, aircraft carrier. You can kind of land on them and say, "Hey, how about I help you with that? How about we do a JV and pilot this thing to be part of their R&D?" And so it goes from, you thought you were supposed to be this CEO master of a separate entity, and now you're really helping to lead a concept that will ultimately be something that's swept into another entity that can really realize upon that better.
Love that. So many types of ventures I've been involved in my life, way more than I should have, and not all of them had happy endings. And the last one, which shall remain nameless, was I was able to shut it down in the most honorable way that I've ever been able to shut down anything, because I made, for the reason I think I could do it, was I made the call early enough. I said, you know what?
Yep.
No, here are the reasons this won't make it. I'm not proud of it, but unless someone can show me something differently than the materials I have here, we need to wind this thing down, and the sooner the better. And when I told the largest investor that, they were a little bit shocked, speechless. But over a couple of hours, I
Mm-hmm.
convinced him it was the right thing to do. And how I convinced him was, look, if we do it now, we have enough money to run a going out of business sale to give every single team member months of pay, of comp, on the way out the door, severance packages that were super.
See, and my reaction to that is totally different, which is probably why we do slightly different things, because I view it like a Rubik's Cube. Being able to figure out how to wind something down. First of all, you definitely need the courage to view it early. I see people ride that pony straight into the dust, and then they don't have as many options. I've seen many situations where if people had taken the exit before they ended up on the like
Yep.
express lane
Yeah.
into the dirt, they would have been so much, and they would have left with a lot more of their dignity and a willingness for people to
Yep.
invest in them again. To say, we know that you understand how to get this done, and you can go back. You haven't just torched every
Right.
supplier relationship you have. When they see you come in, they're like, "Oh, we don't talk to you. You
Yep.
screwed us the last time." So being able to do that, it's better to leave the party, before the
Yeah.
last song.
Yeah. No kidding. Now, Will, what I'm most proud about that whole thing when I convinced the lead investor that it was time, we had a little under $1.3 million in the bank. So it wasn't completely obvious what was that we would have that outcome, but it was if you did some forecasting with that cash, which I did.
Yep.
And when it was finally done, and we literally were audited for all of our closing documents to be sure everything. And I got a forensic accountant to go back over all the books because everyone's looking for a way to try to sue this company, and was able to pay him. He said everything we did was completely legit. And when it was all over, I had $80 left in the bank. So I called,
No.
the lead investor and I said, "Hey man, I got $80 for you." And he said, "Mm-hmm." He said, "Well, how much have you taken out of this company?" I said, "Since day one, zero." So he said, "You know what? Take your wife out to dinner." And that was it. That was it in the end. But I never want to do that again. But I was proud that I was able to, the customers, the employees, the suppliers, you can't, it's not a good feeling when
Yeah.
they get left stranded.
Do you think you would have had the foresight to do that earlier in your career, or was this the product of having seen this a
The
few
product,
times?
having seen it a few times, because you can't, and also I also told myself, and I believe this, I would perhaps make a bad decision the next time because I've done this. I've wrapped up a business the right way. Knowing myself, I might pull the trigger too soon on something that has merit just because I was able to pull that off, and that's no bueno for anybody. And so and that was another reason you made me remember. That was another thing I thought about at the end is I may be ruined as a entrepreneurial founder because I might pull the trigger way too soon on bad idea, or it's going to be too
Mm,
tough, or the array of reasons that make someone want to cut and run. I kind of knew them all, and I didn't want to find
yeah.
myself in that situation again.
Yeah, but sometimes it's if you know what the journey's going to be like and it's going to be worth it, you'll do it. But I guess sometimes, like you said, if you'd really thought about it as you went up there, you might not decide
Yep,
to jump
yep,
off.
yep.
So
Well,
it's,
this
I
has
think
been
it's worth it.
fun. I think we've had a good second season. What do you think? Let's do a little self-assessing. How, do you think the second season was what was good? What should we do less of in the future? What should we maybe do more of in the future? Any thoughts on that?
Mm. That takes some introspection. I think it's important to really have a lot of strong takeaways and not a lot of dead airtime or dead chatter, because I think it's so important for this time to be valuable and to concentrate on the aha moments for people. I also think moving up a little bit in the life cycle of the company, because becomes kind of the same story a little bit over and over again, but maybe moving up life cycle could be an interesting evolution of the
You mean
discussion.
like emerging growth?
And I
You mean
think
like
that
emerging, like a company that's reached profitability but now has to consider, how do I grow? Do I grow? How do I grow? Is it adjacencies? Is it acquisitions? You mean that kind of thing? Or what?
well, and folks who've built a team, who've gotten financed, and are really going to that next thing. Most of the folks we talked to were still looking for that next little piece of the rocket to push them into being a true concern, a true going concern
Yep.
that they knew, all right, we should be able to run for 3 years with where we are. We just need to make sure we do it right. Or, if somebody would have said, all right, I want to do a raise because we need some salespeople and we're going to do that. Well, how about the people who've successfully done the raise and are now deploying those salespeople And now we're in a position to say, okay, how's that working? How, what did that look like? Because they've got more concrete execution kinds of stories to deal with and issues to deal with that are kind of the next level.
Yeah. Good. Good. We will keep talking in season 3 somewhere down the road.
All righty. Thanks, everybody. This has been Leveling Up with Gary and Jill.